Welcome to The Point with Ana Kasparian. I'm your host, Ana Kasparian, and we have a great show ahead for you guys. Before we meet our panelists, we have our No Filter segment, and the show also consists of really great topics, including poverty in the United States and whether or not we have given up on solving that problem. We're also going to talk about whether or not police forces are shooting first and asking questions later. And then what's going on in the world of politics? Why is it that it seems as though the GOP, the leaders in the GOP, are lying to their followers, to the people that believe in their party? And finally, we will close the discussion by discussing some of the most right-wing people in the country and what they think about Girl Scout cookies. Is there some sort of conspiracy going on with the Girl Scouts? But before we get to all of that, as I mentioned, we will go to today's No Filter, which today discusses the topic of media and how they like to exploit people for their mental illnesses. Toby Shelton is a 33-year-old man. He's a singer-songwriter in Los Angeles who allegedly spent $100,000 on plastic surgery to look like Justin Bieber. Now, the press has been reporting about this. The story has gone viral, and people really like making fun of him because, oh my God, he looks like a freak. I mean, he spent so much money on these fillers and the chin reduction and all these different surgeries that make him look a little unrealistic. But I actually think that there's a huge problem with the way the press is covering this story. Look, if someone has a condition like this, which I believe is body dysmorphic disorder, you don't tear him down and make fun of him. If anything, you treat this type of story with a little bit of sensitivity. Now, he started having plastic surgery at the age of 23 when he had 3 different hair transplant procedures. Now, already you know that this kid has a little bit of a problem, and I'm not saying that because I think plastic surgery is wrong in all instances. I actually have a pretty open mind when it comes to plastic surgery. But when someone spends $100,000 on plastic surgery to look like a specific celebrity, there are obviously issues there. So instead of discussing the prevalence of body dysmorphic disorder or discussing how this guy probably needs some sort of professional help for the problem that he has, people have decided to make fun of him and to basically tear him apart in the press, which I have a huge problem with. Now, I don't want to come off as a hypocrite, and I want to make sure that I disclose how I have done the same thing in the past. 5 years ago, we used to talk about Heidi Montag, who had 10 different plastic surgery procedures in one session. And we would make fun of her because we felt that she was just a fame whore and that she was so self-absorbed and obsessed with the way she looked. But the reality is, these types of insecurities and these types of thoughts that people have about themselves should be discussed in a professional way, in a sensitive way. And I really hope that people change their tune when it comes to dealing with Toby Shelton. And this isn't me trying to be self-righteous. This is me trying to step back and think about a story from a completely different perspective. Now, I should also note that $100,000 is a significant amount of money to pay for plastic surgery, and I think that a discussion about the moral obligation of plastic surgeons should also come up. When is enough enough? Should plastic surgeons allow people to have as many surgeries as possible? Shouldn't they step back and think, hey, you know what? This person might have a little bit of a problem. Let me rethink whether or not I am going to allow this procedure to go through. Tell me what you guys think. I love reading your comments on these No Filter segments. Also the comments on The Point. We love hearing your feedback. And with that said, let's go ahead and meet today's panelists. Michael Stoll is professor and chair of public policy in the School of Public Affairs and associate director of the Center for the Study of Urban Poverty at UCLA. He's also the author of Do Prisons Make Us Better? The Benefits and Costs of the Prison Boom. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Desi Doyen is the fabulous co-host and managing editor of the informative, entertaining, and nationally syndicated Green News Report radio show, bradblog.com, as well as a regular fill-in here at TYT. Thank you so much for coming back.
Thanks.
And Dr. Paul Chabot is the founder and president of Chabot Strategies, a national security consulting firm, a former Republican candidate for the California Assembly, and the author of Eternal Battle Against Evil, a comprehensive strategy to fight terrorists, drug cartels, pirates, gangs, and organized crime. Geez, that sounds like a pretty hefty book there.
It is. A good read.
Right, all right, sounds good. Well, I want to start off with our first segment on poverty, and this is something that, we can all kind of speak to. It's a growing issue here in the United States, and Sean Hannity spoke about it a little bit on Fox News, so let's hear what he had to say.
As the number of your fellow Americans living in poverty has now spiked to levels not seen in nearly half a century. Now, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, nearly 50 million Americans are now living in poverty. Now, that's 1 in 6 Americans that are now living below the poverty line. Now, the U.S. has not seen these numbers since the 1960s. Now, that's not all. The report also points out that 20% of the country's children, that's our kids, they're living in poverty, which, of course, is an utter disgrace. Now, even more frightening, the most recent data reveals that more than 47 million people in this country, 47 million, they now need food stamp assistance. Now, to put this number in perspective, the number of Americans on food stamps, that exceeds the entire population of Spain. And nearly half of all the participants in the program are children. That's 20 million kids to be exact. Now, it seems like there's no end in sight.
So Sean Hannity does discuss something that is a growing issue here in the United States. Just to give you some numbers from a recent report, it actually turns out that a huge amount of children here in the U.S. are living in poverty, about 50%. By 2011, almost half of the nation's 50 million public school students, 48% I should say, qualified for free or reduced priced meals. In some states such as Mississippi, that proportion actually rose to 71%, which is huge. 13 states in the South and 4 Western states with the largest populations in 2011 had the high poverty rates among children. A decade earlier, just 4 states reported poor children as a majority of the student population in their public schools. So, you know, this is a really interesting situation because, of course, you have 2 different parties that have 2 different solutions to the issue of poverty. But regardless of what their solutions are, nothing has really been passed to combat this issue. Recently, the House of Representatives did pass a bill that would cut the food stamp program. And I'm wondering whether or not that's really the right way to go about things, considering the number of children that are living in poverty. Michael, the first question goes to you. Have Americans kind of given up on this problem? Have we forgotten about the poor?
No, I don't think that we've forgotten about the poor, but I think over the last 40, 50 years, our views on the causes of poverty have shifted in ways that don't make it very possible for effective policy making to take place. During the War on Poverty in the 1960s, from the General Social Survey, we had pretty clear evidence that most people thought that poverty was a cause from structural factors in the economy, having to do with limited opportunity. That's opposed to the view that I think dominates now, where individuals are held at fault for their own poverty status, either because of the poor choices that they've made or from individual behavior and things like that. And if you look at the General Social Survey, you see that Americans have become much more conservative in their view with regard to conservatism. And I think that's translated into what causes poverty. So the idea that effective government policy making, for example, in jobs programs or other kinds of stimulative efforts that would grow the economy, which has been the, I think, biggest policy that we could have to lower poverty, that doesn't have the same kind of political support, and so it's much more difficult to, I think, address and solve poverty effectively.
Now, Paul, you're on the opposite end of the spectrum. You have Democrats that would advocate for social programs, more funding for public education to ensure that young children have the same opportunities as wealthy children to make something of themselves. But at the same time, you have the Republican Party or conservatives who are advocating for cuts to these social services. I mean, where do you stand on that issue?
Well, I think there's really 2 schools of thought on it. You know, first off, I am a conservative Republican, maybe the only one on the panel, I don't know. But, you know, I grew up poor. I grew up on a dirt road in a house without central air or heat. We could have easily qualified for food stamps, and we didn't. My single parent, my mom, worked the best that she could. And I've been in law enforcement for 17 years, so I've worked in communities. You know, God bless kids. We've got to focus on kids. That's got to be a focus. But I've also seen an entitlement mentality in this country since I've been a kid to now, that really just expects a handout. And these aren't the kids that are the problem. Oftentimes it's the parents or a generational welfare feeling that we're seeing. So we've got to address 2 problems. We can't leave our kids behind, but we also can't let families just continue the entitlement expectation that welfare is a way of life. We want people to get jobs and work, And there was a good work program that I think we had when the Democrats and Republicans worked on this together with Clinton. And I think we've stepped away from that, and I think that's a mistake.
Yeah, at the same time, though, during the Clinton administration, he increased taxes in 1993 for the top 1% to 39%, which is unheard of right now. And those are the same taxes that helped fund public education, which gave young people the opportunities that allowed them to do better in life. So, what would your response be to that? Because right now, the current conservative Republican Party refuses to increase the taxes to create these opportunities for, the most impoverished people in the country.
Yeah, I don't think we can spend our way out of poverty. I think what we need to have is a better education campaign throughout the communities. Look, people don't, I think raising taxes is the wrong approach. I think we're punishing people like myself who worked out of poverty to become successful, who then want to help our communities. I think there's a lot of underlying problems that affect poverty, including crime, gangs, and drugs. We need to look at the base problems right now that I think are out of control in this country that clearly we're, I think, ignoring. We could say we've got a war on poverty, we've got a war on crime, we've got a war on gangs. We're never going to eliminate poverty, but I think we should all be startled at the fact today that we're living in a country where poverty is at levels that I don't think any of us have seen in our generation. It is a massive problem, but I don't think we're talking about it correctly politically.
But that's not exactly true. I mean, poverty is a little bit elevated because of the reverberation of the Great Recession. It's currently about 15%. But during the 1990s, it was at 11%, which over the last 50 years was at its lowest period. And the reason why it was the lowest period is because we pursue growth policies, expansionary fiscal and monetary policy that grew the economy like we've never seen before since the oil embargo in 1973. That had the biggest poverty-reducing effect that we've seen since the 1960s. So expansionary fiscal policy, raising tax rates for the rich, that occurred during one of the biggest growth periods, being able to invest in human capital and other kinds of smart industrial policies, I think is the most effective. But let me also note that poverty rates were highest in 1960, 22%. It was after the War on Poverty programs when we instituted things like food stamps, child care credits, and other kinds of assistance programs that we see poverty decline by its largest amount, 7 points in that 7-year period. And in fact, if you were to count some of the subsidies that are given by government programs, some of which are very effective, like preschool programs, if we were to count those in the income column, poverty numbers would be reduced by about 4 percentage points. So these programs are effective. Some of them could be tweaked and made more effective, but they certainly have had the intended effects that policymakers wanted.
Just a really interesting number before we go to Desi. During the Clinton administration, after he increased taxes, a lot of times, the Republicans would make the same arguments that the Republicans are making today, that if you increase taxes on the wealthiest people in the country, they're unlikely to create new jobs. Well, during that tax hike, we actually increased jobs by 22.7 million. So it's really interesting that they talk about high taxes hindering economic growth, but that's actually not what really happens.
Well, yeah, I mean, the economic data is very clear over the last 60, 70 years that when you do raise the tax rates on the top 1% or the top 1% of the top 1%, that it does tend to lead toward more economic growth and more economic growth policies rather than the Bush administration tax cuts, which I think have proven that there is no link between tax cuts and job creation, only with raising taxes to perhaps the Clinton rates, which weren't even the highest rates that we've had. They were much higher during the Eisenhower years. If we went back to the Clinton tax rates, I think we would see that influx of investment that is kind of required to pull people out of poverty. And also, bringing in what you've talked about as well, about education. Poverty is the single largest predictor of educational outcomes in the United States. And if we are able to invest more in our education, but that requires money, and money to the public school system, that also has other issues involved as well. Children in poverty don't just show up and are ready to learn. They also need other assistance beyond that. So, we've got a lot of big, deep, tectonic plate moving parts going on here with the increase in poverty since the Great Recession. Education, I think, is probably the place that we could focus the most, that I think most people could agree on.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the way education could be funded is also a really hot topic of debate. Just to give you an example, right now, only 10% of the funding for our public schools comes from the federal government. The rest comes from local government. And it's a little problematic because they use property taxes to fund public education. If you are a student living in a poor area, you are not going to have the same resources in your public school that a rich student would have or a wealthier student would have. So I think the way that we fund education is also problematic. And Paul, you mentioned how you grew up in poverty. I grew up pretty poor too. I'm the child of 2 immigrants. We didn't have much growing up. And my dad was doing everything he could to pay off an apartment building that he had bought. And I remember that, the way things worked out for me was that I had certain opportunities that kids don't have these days. When I went to college, for instance, I got a full scholarship. That doesn't happen anymore. Education has become so expensive that the majority of students that graduate have a tremendous amount of student loan debt, and they essentially become indentured servants for the rest of their lives because they can't pay that off. So you and I had some opportunities that the current generations do not have, and I think that that's a little problematic. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I think we've priced out education. I think the cost of college today is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, I've got a master's, a bachelor's, and a doctorate, and you look at the student loan debt that I had. So I think we put a lot of emphasis on college, but I think we don't put enough emphasis on the trade, on the skills. Even though I'm highly educated, I don't think we need to be pushing college. We need to be pushing people into careers where they can be successful. That doesn't necessarily mean that college is the end state for that. So, but I think the other issue that we haven't talked about that really affects kids is we have a lot of broken homes in this country. We have a lot of kids growing up with single parents. We've got a lot of single parents who are working 2-3 jobs. There's very little responsibility for the child when they go home. Unfortunately, we have more gang members on our streets here in the U.S. than we do police officers. And if kids don't have supervision when they go home, who becomes their parent? It's the community. And unfortunately, especially here in Los Angeles, you look at the communities that are just decimated with gangs and drugs. So there are some underlying problems here, and I don't think we can get to the big ones until we look at why family values are crumbling across the country. And I think that is a core conversation to have.
So how would you propose that we deal with the issue of family values? How do you, the family structure has changed significantly in the country. The divorce rate is extremely high, right. And there are a ton of tax incentives for people to get married and remain married. Sure. So how much more of an incentive can we give them, and how do we solve that problem?
I don't know if it's even an incentive. I just think over generations we've become just desensitized over time to things that were not acceptable at one point and are acceptable today. And I think we just keep chipping away at the morals and values of a community. I look at it from being on the streets in law enforcement, or we run anti-drug coalitions trying to keep kids off of drugs. You look at how many parents today show up to a PTA meeting out of a school with thousands of kids. You get 5 parents showing up. There's big concerns there. I think we need to put more responsibility and onus on the parent or parents to take responsibility for their children. It begins at home. And I think homes are broken today, and I think a lot of parents are to blame for their kids growing up the way that they do.
See, I would approach it from a different place. I would say that we have, say, a whole segment of society that is not getting the support and the education that they need, whether it's parenting classes, whether it's making a living wage so that they don't have to work 2 and 3 jobs, so that they can show up to the PTA meeting instead of working the night shift at McDonald's. They have other options and other training and other job opportunities that are simply not there. I mean, you cannot support a family of 4 as a single mom with 1, 2, or 3 kids. If you're a single mom, you cannot support a family on a minimum wage salary.
If I could just add on, and that's where my heart goes out, it's really the single parents that are working their tails off night. My mom did that. I mean,
my mom did too.
You watch these parents, but my mom raised me on good values and morals, kept me out of gangs, kept me off of drugs, talking about what was right and wrong. Today we have too many parents that say, not my kid. My kid doesn't have that problem. I can't tell you the times that law enforcement takes a kid home who's on the streets, and the parents are upset at the cops for taking the kid home when the cop's just trying to do the right job. I think too many parents today are really part of the problem rather than part of the solution, because we're not having this honest discussion about what's happening in the home.
And what would be an effective way to deal with that? That's, I think, where we are. What would be the effective thing to do?
Yeah, I mean, we could have this discussion too. I mean, single parent is a factor of many things, including, I think, increasing empowerment of women to make choices about whom they should be with and whether or not it's actually good for them and their family. So there's a lot of different factors. But I wanted to come back to your point on this school equalization question that you were saying, because actually in many states, when there is unequalized funding as a result of differences in property values, provide schools with that delta or that gap to equalize funding. But I think California, is at the head of the curve because they get it right. Is it just to take kids who come from very different kinds of socioeconomic backgrounds and give them equal funding and expect equal outcomes in schooling? And I think the answer to that question is no, that in some certain circumstances, you have to give kids in more disadvantaged neighborhoods and more disadvantaged schools more money, because you have a lot more headwinds and challenges to address to get to the point where you could focus on learning. And I think that is the central question for us too. But I also want to note that, you know, a lot of the talk about gangs and crime and all that is somewhat exaggerated too. I mean, over the last 20 years, crime rates have fallen, and especially some of these hard hit neighborhoods. Violent crime rates out there are all-time low. Gang membership per 100 youth joining gangs has fallen, you know, to radical new lows, and part of that has to do with policy. Part of it has to do with smart community policing by police. But a lot of but the social conditions have still remained the same. Yet these outcomes are improving. High school graduation rates are up. School attendance are up in a lot of these different kinds of communities, in part because we've been doing smart policy. And we're not just leaving it to individuals to make their own choices.
Yeah, and you know, to Paul's point about drug use, you know, drug use is definitely a problem, and we've been using a tremendous amount of funding for this war on drugs, which has not been successful. So we kind of have to prioritize where our funding should go. But you know what? This was a great conversation. We have to take a quick break. When we come back, we will talk about cops and whether or not they are increasingly using the strategy of shooting first and asking questions later. And then also, is the leadership in the GOP lying to its followers or to its people? Followers sounds a little harsh, so I won't say followers. Anyway, just stick around. We'll be right back. Welcome back to The Point. Lately, it seems like there's been an increase in the number of police officers that are shooting and killing unarmed civilians. And of course, this gets people very upset about the excessive force that's being used in these incidents. Now, we do have one example, and we want to show you guys a video, and then I have even more examples for you. Take a look.
It was 2:30 Saturday morning when 24-year-old Jonathan Farrell swerved off the road in a single-car accident. He climbed out the rear window and knocked on the front door of this house looking for help. The startled homeowner thought it was a burglar and called 911.
911, hello? I need help.
Police have altered the caller's voice to protect her identity.
Is he still in the house? Did he leave yet? No, he's not in the house. He's in the front yard yelling. Oh, my God.
3 police officers responded. When Farrell ran toward them, Officer Randall Carrick drew his gun and shot Farrell 10 times. The dead man was unarmed. The Charlotte-Mecklenburg police charged Carrick with voluntary manslaughter and said he did not have a lawful right to discharge his weapon. Michael Green is his defense attorney.
It will be found that Officer Carrick's actions were justified on the night in question.
Farrell, a former collegiate football player, had no criminal record.
Now, these cases aren't black and white. Obviously, there are many factors at play here. I mean, you hear the 911 call. The woman was obviously very frightened. So police kind of went into the situation already assuming that he was an armed robber. There were other instances, though. There was a man from Georgia by the name of Jack Lamar Robinson. He was a diabetic man who was shot and killed after his family called 911 for him. He had overdosed on his diabetes medicine. Police officers said that he had charged at them. However, he was unarmed. There was a 95-year-old man by the name of John Warna from Chicago who died after police tased him, and they struck him with beanbag rounds when he threatened them with a butcher's knife. There was a Texan by the name of James Barton who was shot by police officers after getting out of his car during a routine traffic stop. So a lot of these cases have been popping up recently. We've been doing a lot of extensive coverage on it on the Young Turks. But I want to bring in the panel to see whether or not you guys think that this is a trend. Desi, do you think that these are just little isolated incidents that are getting a lot of press attention, or do you feel that this actually is a trend, this whole notion of shooting first, asking questions later?
Well, I know for me it feels like it's a trend. It feels like this is happening more often, but I really don't have the statistics to back that up. It could be that it is just anecdotal, and it's the spread of social media and the spread of people being able to share news stories more quickly and more readily nowadays than they were before. I think, though, it kind of speaks to how we have sort of militarized the police. This is something that we've talked about before, how when you have so much money that has gone into the defense establishment, the defense industry, making a lot of guns, a lot of tanks, a lot of rifles, a lot of weaponry that then gets put input and sort of secondhand get sent down to the police departments, and then not necessarily as much funding for training. A lot of money for equipment and toys, not as much money for training of police officers. So I'm wondering if there might be some sort of skew in our priorities and our funding and policy priorities that are preventing us from giving police officers the full equipment and training they need to ensure that when they get into that situation, it doesn't escalate unnecessarily.
You make a really good point about the training. When it comes to dealing with those who have mental disabilities, you know, the police enforcement throughout the country doesn't really have, there's no real federal standard to it, so it differs from one department to another. And as a result, you know, there are some departments in the country that don't know how to deal with someone who has Down syndrome, for instance. There was a case involving a guy by the name of Robert Ethan Saylor. He was a 26-year-old with Down syndrome, and he was at a movie theater and he tried to watch the same movie twice without paying for it. Police officers were called to the scene. This kid refused to leave. Well, he's a man, 26, but he refused to leave, and it led to them basically choking him, and he died of asphyxiation. So these types of situations kind of bring up the whole training issue. But Paul, I want to bring you in because you said you were a police officer at one point.
Correct. I think that these are isolated incidents. I think 300 million people in this country, cops are on our streets all the time. Things happen. They make decisions like that, and in hindsight, you can go back and go, gosh, how did that happen? Look, I think you're damned if you do, damned if you don't today in law enforcement. 20 years ago, I would have recommended folks go into a career in law enforcement. Today, I would probably recommend, I wouldn't want my kids to go in it. I think not only do you have the crooks against you, oftentimes in the streets, you know, you get sometimes parents yelling at you. Now you get the media coming down on you for very little pay. And I will say, I think collectively we have outstanding training. We have to be certified by state agencies. Here in California, it's post police officer standard training. So we do a lot of training. But when you see incidences like that, a young man who was shot 10 times, you just go, how did that happen? I can't put myself in that officer's mind, nor do I want to. It's a tragic loss, and we have to look at that. We can certainly learn and train from every incident, but we are human beings, and we, just like everybody else, are going to make mistakes. When those mistakes happen, absolutely we need to learn from them. My question would be, from that incident, how are we then going to train law enforcement? Certainly, they went to a 911 call with lights screaming to get there, a citizen calling for help. It's nighttime, and you see a subject running at you who matches the description. So in the back of your mind, as a law enforcement officer, you've got a few split seconds to make a decision. What we don't talk about is a lot of cops are getting shot today around this country, you know, as well. So we have violence that are taking out the good folks who are protecting us. We should not, I think, allow isolated incidences to bastardize those that are getting paid, very few, to protect us all 24/7.
Some of them are isolated, some of them are predictable. And let me just say that we don't really have good statistics historically on police brutality. We only recently started collecting them. But when we have, we see that they occur for about 3 incidents per 100 officers across the nation. So it's, you know, argues 3% high or low, I don't know. What I do know is that when they occur, they're fairly costly because they're legal battles and lawsuits that are settled, sometimes on the order of $3 to $5 million of city or state money that otherwise could have gone to other kinds of significant social programming to manage crime or to train police, so those are wasted resources. But there are also racialized incidents. There are also incidents in which predominantly the officers are non-black and the victims are either black or Latino. And so yes, there is training that takes place. Training across the country has ramped up, but the notions around cultural sensitivity and training hasn't met that kind of training standard that most states have had. Let me also say that why I say it's predictable is because in many states and cities, police departments have adopted police review boards, citizen commission police review boards, where citizens have oversight over the behavior and the policies and procedures of police. When you have those, the kind of police brutality incidents that we've shown have fallen dramatically because there is citizen participation in the accountability of police officers. And where you don't have that, then all the factors in society like racial bias and over-policing and brutality and everything that comes into society plays itself out on the street, and police officers are not immune to those kind of larger cultural influence as well.
Lots of great points by Michael. Unfortunately, we got to move on to the next topic, but this is an ongoing issue, and there's also the whole notion, or the question, I should say, of police officers using or overusing non-lethal weapons like tasers. That issue comes up quite a bit, and I'm sure we will address the issue of the militarization of our police force in future shows. We've already done it quite a bit, but it is a growing issue. It is a growing issue, especially considering the weapons manufacturers and the fact that they need to turn a profit. All right, moving on. Chris Hayes was recently talking to a conservative activist by the name of Ben Dominic, and Hayes asked a really interesting question about the GOP potentially lying to those in the party. Let's take a look.
Rank and file members of conservative grassroots who I just substantively disagree with. These hucksters tell you things that are false. They lie to you. Ted Cruz lies to you. Heritage Action lies to you. Everybody lies to you. There's a whole cottage industry before the election to tell you you're winning an election they're losing. They tell you your ideas are popular when they are not. They tell you your party is winning when it is not. They tell you the president is losing this and he looks terrible because people are storming the World War II memorial. At what point do grassroots conservatives stop allowing their leadership to lie to them?
Well, I think that you have to keep in mind the leadership lies to themselves as well. They lied to themselves about their ability to control the situation. They lied to themselves about the ability to offer an alternative approach from the Senate side that could get taken up by the House at the get-go. I think that essentially you're seeing a lot of people who are lying to each other about the nature of the policies and the nature of the political strategy that they're employing. And I think that in a sense they got distracted from what I think is one of the biggest lies of all that was told to anybody in Washington. Sometimes it is pretty profitable to tell lies, tell people what they want to hear. The only problem is when it runs into smack dab into reality.
Ben Dominic from the Heartland Institute. Thanks a lot. Stick around.
Thanks.
Fascinating, because it seems as though Dominic is totally acknowledging that the GOP does lie to those in the party. So I'm going to start with Paul, since he is a conservative Republican. Do you feel like you've been lied to by these hucksters, as was mentioned in that video?
Generally, no. Look, I worked for two presidents in the White House, Clinton and Bush, as a conservative Republican. I think D.C. today is beyond a train wreck. We have a president who doesn't engage Congress. We've got a lot of infighting and bickering over clear divisions on major issues. And I don't see our base lying to us at all. I think I see our base as frustrated with a media and a president that can get away consistently with so many things that had it been a Republican, he would have been skewered, and Bush was skewered, and still is 7 years or 6 years.
As he should be.
No, out of office.
Bush was a train wreck. You want to talk about train wreck?
I disagree, ma'am.
You disagree? He destroyed our economy. He got us involved in a preemptive war. He was a complete and utter disaster. He destroyed our civil liberties, and Obama continues to do so. You're really going to say that Bush was not a terrible president?
Absolutely. We should have an hour conversation on that so I can address every single one of those points.
That's absurd. But go ahead.
We all have our positions on that.
So I look at the lack of leadership that we have today, and to me it goes to the top, to the president. And I think our Republican base is just disgusted with what we see happening to our country before us. I think a lot of our Republicans have different ways of trying to handle this problem. Some may do it right, some may do it wrong. But look, I don't think we can take isolated incidents like we may take with our Republican Party and certain members of cops and generalize that to our party. I think we on our Republican side are very proud of our values, and that's not going to change. Do I think some people are disgusted with maybe a lack of motivation or going after certain things that we think the media should pay attention to? Absolutely. So, hey, look, I look at D.C. today as not what our founding fathers expected of our electeds to be from the top down, and we've got a lot of work to do.
I find it fascinating that you think that the Republican Party should stay true to its conservative values. Its conservative values are precisely the reason why they lost the last election.
Well, I would disagree with you that. I would say that it's not necessarily conservative values. There are Tea Party values. There are sort of farther right wing than the traditional conservative party used to be. The traditional conservatives used to be about, conservation of the environment. They used to be about, helping the poor. They used to have other policies that we sort of all in general agreed upon. And,
but if you look at
I don't see the Tea Party doing that.
I think we still are.
Really?
Yes.
If you look at the last election, though, Desi, and I do disagree with you a little bit about that, because in the last election, Tea Party values did take control of the Republican Party, and they focused on a ridiculous war on contraception and reproductive rights. They did not engage the Latino vote and the minority vote. I mean, they were so defiant in their social views, and that did end up hurting them. And just going back to what you said, Paul, about Obama refusing to work with the Republicans, that's all Obama did in his first term. That was the most frustrating part about his presidency. When it comes to the Affordable Care Act, that was a huge concession. That was a huge concession to Republicans, and now they're turning around and saying, like, no, we're not happy with it. And they're telling Republicans that it is largely unpopular. That is not true.
Not a single Republican voted for the Obamacare.
But it was the Heartland Institute's original policy.
Exactly.
But no, look, not a single Republican voted for it. It got pushed through when the Democrats were in control, and they had a Democrat in the White House. So look at what's happened since then. Remember what Nancy Pelosi said? Hey, we got to read the bill, right? We'll read it after we vote on it. I mean, those are the kind of things that disgusted so many Americans, which is why the Tea Party had such great success in turning the House over to the Republicans.
The Affordable Care Act originally was supposed to have a public option. The public option got scrapped because Obama wanted to work with the Republicans. So now we have a federal mandate to buy private insurance, something that is very, very popular with conservatives because, of course, they love corporations and they love companies. So now we're forced to buy from private insurers. I mean, that was a huge concession to Republicans. And then the reason why Congress did not vote for it is because they don't want Obama to get credit for something that could possibly be very popular with the American people.
It was a conservative idea, and even now conservatives don't like that.
Let me tell you one.
I
think there's one thing we'll all agree on. And this comes back to Obamacare and policy. Has anybody here been to a VA hospital where our vets have to deal with disabilities and issues and injuries?
Yes.
The VA is one of the biggest train wrecks ever, and I go to it consistently along with other veterans for service. If the federal government cannot run our VA healthcare system effectively after all these years, how can we expect them
Why
to
don't you
run
discuss
national
the
healthcare?
cuts to funding for those types of services?
They have increased funding consistently, and both sides of the aisle have, and Republicans consistently push for more treatment. You had a Democrat out here in Los Angeles walking the VA halls out here saying, how come I can't get answers or responses? That's a federal system, which is a blatant failure. They're not going to get any better with Obamacare, with citizens, 300 million across the country.
We got to go to break, but just unfortunately, I can go on with this for a really long time. But just going back to what Paul said, I mean, this is always the Republican argument: cut funding to something, and then turn around and say, "Oh, look at what a failure it is when the government is running it." They do the same thing with public education. You cut funding for public education, you create charter schools, you create a voucher system, as they've done in Louisiana, where you suck the money out of public schools and you put it into private vouchers. And then when the schools fail, Republicans will say, look at that school failing. The government can't do anything right. It's bullshit. All right, we got to take a break, and when we come back, one final story. Welcome back to The Point. Is there a conspiracy behind Girl Scout cookies? Let's ask Pastor Kevin Swanson.
You ought to say no to the Girl Scout cookies, too. I mean, I don't want to support lesbianism. I don't want to support Planned Parenthood, and I don't want to support abortion. And if that be the case, I'm not buying Girl Scout cookies. The vision of the Girl Scouts of America is antithetical to a biblical vision for womanhood, friends. It's antithetical to it. Please, I beg of you, do not buy Girl Scout cookies. Please, I beg of you. Stop buying Girl Scout cookies.
Okay. So first question was supposed to go to Desi, but I'm actually going to ask Paul, because you identify as a conservative Republican. How do you still do it when you have people like that as part of your party? I mean, do you guys reject them openly, or do you accept them?
Hey, no disrespect to the pastor. I don't know him. Maybe I should. And so, look, I'm a Christian too. I don't think I knew half of what he was talking about there. I like Girl Scout.
I don't think anyone did.
I like Girl Scout cookies. In the vets, we go to our USOs for military, and there's Girl Scout cookies all over the place for us. But I think maybe he's talking about a crumbling of values, and I don't know. I'd have to read more into it. So I'm sure he has some points there, but I don't think we can take it out on Girl Scout cookies.
Desi, were you a Girl Scout, and are you worried about these Girl Scout cookies turning everyone into a lesbian?
Well, apparently, with the number of Girl Scout cookies I have had over the years, I must be full-on lesbian by now, because I love Girl Scout cookies. Don't laugh. That's anyway. No, actually, I was a campfire girl. So, but I think that the issue that this brings up is sort of this hate mongering, radicalization of, hey, let's demonize whoever we can because it helps us make money. I think it's sort of an industry thing, it's a sham and a huckster. I think this guy, this pastor, I don't know, what part of Christianity he thinks, accusing the Girl Scouts of creating lesbians is just, to me, insane.
Well, we never said they cause heterosexualism either.
That's true, but apparently your trefoils are like commie something. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, and the fact is that American views on gay marriage and other kinds of things have changed radically. I mean, 84% of American people now approve of gay marriage. I mean, I would suggest that those same 84% could care less who and how the cookies were made, as long as they taste good.
Yeah, I think that where he's coming from is a place of fear because, Girl Scouts have traditionally been a little more liberal than Boy Scouts. They've been more accepting of transgendered individuals, which I think is great. So conservatives obviously have a little bit of an issue with that. They have an issue with them being accepting of the homosexual community as well. So, he thinks that buying these Girl Scout cookies will somehow support their cause, their liberal cause. And it's strange to me that someone would spend so much time focusing on or being paranoid about something that they shouldn't be paranoid about. I mean, there's a lot of issues out there to be paranoid about, but the issue of Girl Scouts and Girl Scout cookies is a non-issue.
Well, sometimes for people like this, they get the unintended effect where the Girl Scout cookie purchase prices, sales actually get a bump up.
Right.
Because people want to demonstrate their support for these cookies irrespective of all the politics around it.
Same thing happened with
so
Chick-fil-A,
maybe he's a paid advisor by Girl Scouts.
That's actually 100% true. I mean, there was this whole hoopla about Chick-fil-A, and their CEO did not want to support gay marriage, and then people were really upset about it. It didn't hurt their sales at all. In fact, their sales increased. So I think the same thing could happen with the Girl Scouts. So you know what, Pastor Kevin Swanson, keep going, keep talking, smack about Girl Scout cookies. People are going to keep buying them. All right, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I do want to thank our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Michael Stoll, please tell our audience more about your work.
Sure, I just published a new book called Why Are So Many Americans in Prison, which is joint with Steve Raphael, who's at UC Berkeley. And there we find that 80% of the increase in the incarcerated population in the United States was driven by policy, and it had very little to do with increased criminality amongst American people. But it came with tremendous social consequence now. And I think that there's room, because of a whole host of crisis in state budget, for policy reform that will reduce sentencing while also maintaining our current levels of low crime rates.
That sounds excellent. Desi Doyen.
Yes, you can find all of our reports at greennews.bradblog.com and follow me on Twitter at Green News Report.
Excellent. And Dr. Paul Chabot.
As the token Republican on the board, I'd like to thank you all for having me here today. And I'd like to encourage you to check out my website. It's battleevil.com. This is a book I wrote based on my experience in Iraq, but also with drug cartels and organized crime, and how we can have an impact as a community to fight what I see as a true battle of good versus evil in our world today.
I'm Ana Kasparian. You guys can check me out Monday through Friday from 3 to 5 p.m. Pacific time. And of course, we want to hear what you guys thought of today's show. So please subscribe if you haven't done so already, and comment below. We do read your comments, and we do take your constructive criticism. Have a great week, and we'll see you soon.